kind of a personal story of a friend of mine. His name's John, and I have his permission to share this story with you. So John, when he was in college, he was from the South. He was from one of the Carolinas. I don't remember which right now. And he came from a very religious Southern Baptist family. I think his uncle or something like that was a Southern Baptist minister, and pretty strict household. And so he went to a big university in one of the southern towns for his university. But part of the issue with John was that he was gay, and he couldn't be open to his family, and he felt like he couldn't be open to society that he was with, just obviously his close friends and sort of the gay community in the university. And at the time he went there, even that wasn't that public. And so he was trying to live his life as best he could in secret. And he was a very conscientious gay man, and as conscientious gay men are, they tend to go get checkups at least once a year to see if they are healthy and haven't gotten any diseases and that kind of thing. So he obviously didn't have any money because he's a student, so he went to a free clinic to go get his tests done, and he had come back to hear the results. And a woman came out front, called John's name, went back to the back, and she looked at him kind of gravely and said, "Well, I need to let you know you tested positive for HIV." And of course this hit John like a ton of bricks, because that's, a death sentence at that young age is sombering to anybody at any age, but even at that young age, he hadn't expected it. And he started trembling, started breaking down, started crying uncontrollably. And then the woman looked at him squarely and said, and I hope you understand that this is God's way of punishing you for the lifestyle that you've done, and I hope you repent." And he just kind of looked up and stared at her. He had never even thought about the fact that this free clinic was run by some sort of religious organization. Students don't tend to think about those kinds of things. So obviously this is clearly not what he wanted to hear at that moment. And he kind of was bewildered. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't believe this was happening to him. But he knew he had to get out of there. So he just abruptly stood up and with tears streaming down his eyes, just sort of hastily almost ran out the clinic and got into his car and just started driving around this town. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know where to go. He wasn't even in a relationship at the time, so he didn't have a boyfriend he could call, and he obviously couldn't call his parents or any of his family. So he felt very, very, very much all alone. And he said he just drove around town for what seemed like an hour, not knowing what to do. And then at one point, he realized that this is kind of ridiculous, because he was crying so hard he couldn't even see, and that then he was going to probably get in an accident, and then he'd have to explain to the police officer, and so it's like, okay, this is crazy. And he happened to be driving by the Unitarian Universalist Church in town. And he had been there once, he said, for either a movie or a talk or something. And he remembers that they were kind of cool people and probably okay with him. And so he just parked in their parking lot and went inside. It was a weekday, morning or midday, and he couldn't find anybody in the building, and he just kind of wandered around, and he finally found where they kept their copier and office supplies in this little room. And he went in there and collapsed on the floor and just was crying and bawling. And it turns out the office administrator actually was in the building, just didn't happen to be at her office at the time, and eventually heard him and came into the room and sat by him and just held his hand and just comforted him. Very calmly, not accusatory, didn't even try to give him 50 questions, just sort of, obviously somebody's in distress here and they just need to be held. And she did that for about an hour and just was with him. And after about an hour, she finally asked, "Well, is it okay with you if I call the minister and have him come over as well?" And John agreed. And so she left to call the minister, and then the minister came. And then he did the same thing and just was there with John in the copy room on the floor, just kind of helping him calm down, helping him pull it together to get through the rest of the day. After about another hour, the minister asked if it would be okay if he could take him to the emergency room in the hospital and check him in for psychiatric reasons. And John agreed, and so he ended up being checked into the psych ward at the hospital. And he says to this day that was one of the best things that happened, because there's a very high rate of suicide for people when they first find out that they are diagnosed with, that they're HIV positive. Well, John got better in the psych ward. And actually, while he was there, I think he got retested or something, and it turns out that the diagnosis was false. That he wasn't HIV positive after all. But his experience with just 2 people at that congregation, in addition to whatever talk he had been at before, he was very impressed with that Unitarian Universalist congregation. I mean, he had grown up Southern Baptist, and to this day, if you see him pray, he does the whole hands in the air, Pentecostal kind of thing. That's where he's very comfortable. And so having a religious organization, I don't think he'd even been to a service, so he didn't know what we were about or anything. But just the people that he had met there, the minister and the office administrator and whoever was at that event, just really impressed him, and he started going there to services. And the thought had never crossed his mind that you could be openly gay and be religious at the same time, in a southern city, no less. And so the congregation really endeared themselves to him and he to them. And he really felt supported through the rest of his college years there, and it made an impact on him. Well, after he graduated, he had this weird major, some strange dialect of Chinese linguistic blah blah blah. So he lived in China for a while, and then came back to the U.S. and he ended up in Kansas and started going to the Unitarian Universalist fellowship there. It was a fellowship actually, Layla. And something kept calling on him about that remarkable faith of ours. And so he decided eventually to go to seminary, to go to Meadville Lombard. And I had the lucky, it was lucky for me that I had him in a couple of classes and got to know him really well. And a week ago yesterday, he got ordained by that same church that he first went to. He ended up he moved from Kansas back to that southern town and did his internship there. And then they ordained him a week ago yesterday. So it's just this really cool story about how this congregation just, it was not some sort of evangelical thing where they were out on the street trying to save souls, but clearly saved the soul that walked into their doors. And I just think it's an incredible transformational story. So, and that's what I really wanted to talk today about, was transformational congregations and our transformational religion. I don't think we think of it that way all the time, but I think we are often a place where people didn't think of that a place like this existed. You hear that all the time from visitors and new members, and then none of us know. I mean, this is the Midwest, right? We're not very emotional people. We never know who's coming in the doors and their heart's broken, and they maybe are suicidal. And just the fact that they find us and find somebody who cares is a big deal. And I think we need to honor and treasure that. So I had to relate John's story back to the Easter story. And so if you think about it, and I always think of all religious stories as metaphor, I never take any of them literal. And so if you think about the story of Jesus in that Easter story, this is the point at which the story of Jesus reaches its lowest point. So the story opens up essentially on Christmas, where the whole, it was proclaimed that this was going to be the Savior of the world, and we were all going to have this peace and harmony and joyous world after that, and all the bad things on earth were going to were going to fix themselves. And then we get to this point where Jesus actually, the story says Jesus gets now brutally and unfairly murdered. And so it reaches its lowest point. So Holy Week, frankly, can be kind of a metaphor for our inner darkness. And I think our feelings of betrayal and aloneness and depression. And I think sometimes I would say, and I've gone through periods like this where you feel dead to the world, even though your body's still pumping blood and your brain is still thinking thoughts. But for some reason, that darkness and depression just keeps pulling you down and holding you. So I love the Christian Easter story because it uses this metaphor of angels to roll away the stone and usher in a new era of resurrection, rebirth, and hope through this powerful image of this risen Savior. I mean, it's this incredible story that obviously most of Christianity is just hooked onto. But I think of John's story, and I think of the real, live, compassionate Unitarian Universalist angels that really helped John eliminate that stone that was holding him down, and the transformational congregation that helped John usher in a new era of his life. So I think the Unitarian Universalist gospel, if we want to use that word, is a story of hope and joy and honestly salvation. And I think, and I'm repeating myself again, but I want to bring that back, that it's not just about lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender folks, but I think all of us feel that we can come here and be our authentic self. I remember that when I was going to the Appleton Fellowship for years. I worked in corporate America, so I had a certain image that I had to uphold and maintain there, and sometimes that got to be exhausting, and I just would love it when I would go to a meeting on a weeknight or on Sunday morning, walk in those doors, and I felt like I could drop all that pretense, and I could just be who I was. And there were other Kimberly Clarkers in that same congregation, and I think we had a different level of relationship just because of that. So I just think that's the kind of place we are. So, going back more on this transformational congregation idea and how it relates to us as individuals, I want to go back to that original reading that we all read together, and talk about the Reverend Teresa Gustillo Gallardo. So I looked her up because I thought that's an unusual name. I don't think I know her. Well, it turns out this month, April 25th in 2013, so 5 years ago, she became the first lesbian Unitarian Universalist minister in the Philippines. Think of how conservative the Philippines are. I mean, the fact that they're ordaining Unitarian Universalists, I don't know if you know this, but in the Partner Church program, there is a group of Unitarian Universalists in the Philippines, down on one of the southern islands. They are homegrown. They had a Christian, not a missionary, he wasn't from another country, he was from the Philippines, that from some pamphlet 80 years ago, discovered Universalism. And it was a pamphlet that came from the Unitarian Universalists here, or the Universalists here, and he embraced the message of Universalism and started churches. And so there's about a dozen churches now on this island, and they were discovered years later, like in the 60s, that there was this connection, and so they're part of the UUA, actually, and they're Unitarian Universalists, and so another part of the Partner Church program. And we have had people come from, seminary students attend Miguel Lombard that have gone back to be ministers over there now. So I thought it was amazing that they had this lesbian Unitarian Universalist minister in the Philippines, and then what was even more amazing in small world, the minister who preached the ordination sermon was the Reverend Roger Birchhausen from the Appleton Fellowship at her ordination. So with that in mind, I re-looked at what she said. So think about this, that she's preaching to a Filipino congregation. And this is a congregation, there are the working poor. This is the rural part of their congregation. It's a collective, and like a sugarcane collective. And so some of the money they get comes from their mutual farming together. So think about that when you hear the words. We are here to derive meaning in our actions. We are here to win our power back over our areas of powerlessness. We are here to deepen our understanding of ourselves in order to strengthen self-discipline. We are here to abolish prejudice with an appreciation for diversity and differences. We are here to feel our personal power and our capacity to affect the lives of others. We are here to become teachers to each other. We are here to spend time away from the usual influences and relearn reality. And when God gives me the desire, I am also given the power and means to achieve my goals. I am here to see that my singular life is a gateway to countless possibilities. So I have to give you another anecdotal story on this one. I'm Facebook friends actually with one of the ministers who came to Meadville Lombard and then went back. I think he just got ordained. But one of his missions was to take the Our Whole Lives program back to the Philippines. So if you're not familiar with Our Whole Lives, it's a Unitarian Universalist, comprehensive human sexuality and healthy relationship curricula that spans from kindergarten actually into your 80s. The curricula that's used the most is for the junior high, maybe 9th grade levels, where it's talking basically sex ed and healthy relationships. It's almost 50-50. But when you take the course, it talks about everything. It talks about every way to prevent pregnancy, every way to avoid sexually transmitted infections. I've taught it a couple of times. There's one session on sexuality and gender identity, and you purposely bring in somebody who identifies as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender, so that the kids can hear the stories from someone who's living with those identities. So I think it's very, very powerful, and he was very, very brave to take this program to the Philippines. The Philippines is a very conservative, very Catholic country, and even the Unitarian Universalists are quite conservative by our standards. And so he tells stories about having all these parents come together and explain what this program was about, and the fact that they actually sent their kids, and they did a whole program, this was a couple years ago, a program where they began to talk that freely about sexuality and healthy relationships in a country where that's been denied forever is, I just think, a miracle. So that's one of the things that I found really fascinating that comes out of what she's talking about. But then I thought, well, there's a couple of these points that are very applicable to us. And the one in particular, we are here to abolish prejudice with an appreciation for our diversity and differences. It really struck me. Because this fellowship, in some ways, you're almost like you're positioned in the Philippines. I mean, from everything I've heard and learned, Fond du Lac is pretty conservative, pretty Catholic, and all wrapped up, but yet here we are. You know, with this oasis of thinking differently, I've always been amazed by the programs that you have in place and how out there you are in the publicly, and I meant that both ways, both the LGBTQ sense, but out there in the sense that getting your word out, that people know that there is a different way to think and a different way to be in Fond du Lac. But with that comes diversity. Because if you look around the room, we all kind of look and think a lot like each other. And as you grow and as you become more appealing to a broader range, you're going to have more diversity coming here, and we want to make sure that they feel comfortable. And I think we all know, we've had a lot of life experience collectively in the room. It means really getting out of our comfort zone sometimes. And people might think and do things that are a little bit different. It means, and in this case, I think it means often not having the traditional people in charge. And so the reason I bring that up is because it's one of my concerns, because you've decided to call me, well, not officially call me, but hire me as a half-time minister. Look at me. I'm a white, middle-aged, highly educated male, right? And so the last thing I would want is for this congregation or our image out there to be, oh, now they've got this, you know, white male, middle-aged minister like everybody else, so we fit in with everybody else, because that's not who we are, right? We are very much collaborative. We're very much share power. I mean, the male thing is probably the most obvious. Females, males, and everything in between holds power here and authority and has opinions, and it's all valuable. So that's one of the things that just struck me that she's talking about in her reading that I want to just throw out there. As we grow and next year will be different. And you're asking me to be more of a manager, but I do not want to be that traditional white minister that you see in sort of more of the Protestant Catholic churches around town. Where am I? Sorry. Okay. I guess the point that I want to wrap up there, as we have more diversity coming in, and we're going to see more and more things of people maybe suggesting things that are unusual, we have to go back to that covenant that I know I preached on probably about 6 months ago. I know, Audrey, you were on a group that helped write it, and you're going to be hearing me bring it back more and more and more, because I believe the covenant is what we have and how we should be together. We don't have a doctrine. We don't have to agree on all these things, but we do have to agree on how we should be with one another. So when things come up, we should be able to turn to that and say, you know, we had a covenant in seminary, and I'm probably repeating stories that I've told before, but we would repeat it in the beginning of every class. Not every class time, but when a class would start up. We had intensive classes, so you'd come to Chicago and you'd be there all week long, from 8 o'clock to 5 o'clock for 5 days. And so the first day, we would all repeat this covenant that all the student body had shared every fall in the kickoff of the year, to remind ourselves of how we should be together. And if there's any place where emotions are going to run ragged, would be in seminary classes, because that's the purpose, is to make you think about things that maybe are a little uncomfortable. And there were times when people would say things that maybe weren't so well thought out and probably hurt somebody in the room. I was in a couple of those situations. And I love the way that seminary worked, is you could just, we always had a key word that we'd agree on, like ouch, or I think we just fell out of covenant there. And no matter what was going on in the classroom, we would stop, because those relationships were the most important thing. It was more important than whatever the topic was that we were talking about. And so then we would talk about, well, what just happened? How come what I just said hurt you? And let's talk about what that meant. And then we kind of get back into covenant, and then we move on. So I found my experience, these covenants are very, very powerful. And I'm hoping that both of my congregations, as in all congregations, struggle with this. But the congregations out there that are the healthiest are the ones who really know they have this covenant, they know how it works, they know that if they're feeling hurt or mad about something, you don't have to go be angry and go tell your friends. You should be able to tell the person directly and let them not get defensive, have a relationship to figure that out. So that's kind of where I'm going with this, and where I hope we can all be with this. And so then, to me, that ties into two more things that she was talking about in that reading, that we are here to feel our personal power and our capacity to affect the lives of other people. And then I'm paraphrasing, I'm slightly editing her words, putting it in the plural. We are here to see that our singular lives are a gateway to countless possibilities. So to me, if you put those two together, if we as a community can really show the world how right relations can work and a healthy relationship, then I think that just embodies and emboldens other people to have gateways to countless possibilities. So to end, I wanted to come back to the great Unitarian poet, Dr. Seuss, with Important Fears of You. I chose that story not just because it's a lovely example of our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of everyone. It's not about just Horton's quote that a person's a person no matter how small. I think this fellowship has a lot of similarity to Whoville and what we should do about it. So great things are happening here, but we are very, very small. Sometimes we feel like we're just on this speck of dust floating around the Fond du Lac area. So I think that we know that people find us by accident, and they always say, if I'd only known that this place existed. So my rallying cry to end this today is that we really should be proud of the transformation that's underway here. We should believe that this place is truly a place of personal transformation, that people like John can find us and become whole again. And then believe that we offer transformation to the world. So Horton is telling the Who's and then us to own our own destiny, to take agency and make everyone holler, make everyone shout, we are here, we are here, we are here. Hallelujah. That's my talk for today. So, I was